Hey everybody, what's good? It's the Tominator, and today I'm very excited to bring you part 2 of the greatest posers of all time. Here we'll be counting down the top 10 bodybuilders to ever grace the stage. In part 1 we saw numbers 20 through 11 as well as some honorable mentions, so if you haven't already, go watch that one first. And since we already laid down the ground rules there, we can jump straight into it here, so let's do this. Rounding out the top 10 is someone who needs no introduction. We're talking about the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger. Woo, talk about kicking the vid off with a bang. And I can already hear the outraged cries, the indignant legions of fanboys pounding fists to tables, cursing me through their phones and computer monitors as they reach for their pitchforks and flaming torches in a swarming mob to come bring to justice this sinful blasphemer who had the sheer audacity to relegate their idol and savior to a mere 10th place. Because God forbid anyone be critical of Arnold. But okay, I hear ya. Probably no one expected him to end up this low, and truth be told, I didn't either. He was originally a little higher, but the more thought I gave to it, and the more actual contest footage I uncovered, the more it confirmed to me that the Austrian Oak was not the best poser to ever live. And if you think that, you need to keep watching and expand your horizons. Now, in Arnie's defense, I will say this. He may very well have been the best there ever was at hiding weak points while showcasing strengths, because he was an absolute master in that regard. Arnold definitely had his share of flaws, but you would never know it the way he posed. He also boasted an extensive array of iconic poses in his arsenal. Again, perhaps no other bodybuilder in history can claim more signature shots to his name. But the reason he ultimately does not score any higher than this is because he was not quite as fluid in his routines as some, nor as elegant in all of his transitions. He was essentially like a slightly better version of Haney in that he was big and imposing and posed powerfully in a way that suited his physique. Yet, despite his aforementioned range, he tended to repeat the same 5 or 6 shots over and over. Someone like Kevin Levrone may have actually been more technically sound, but Arnold had such a vast and enduring influence that he could not possibly be left out of the top 10. To this day, probably nobody's been copied or emulated more than him. Well, except maybe this next guy. Another 70s legend comes in at number 9 in the form of Frank Zane. And this routine, I believe, was from one of his Olympia wins, but I'm not sure what year, so if you happen to know, please post the answer for us in the comments. But just like Arnold, Zane was a true pioneer. Those two together probably invented more timeless signature poses than all the other bodybuilders in history combined. But where Arnold represented aesthetics mixed with Herculean power, Zane embodied mainly just pure aesthetics. He was closer in that sense to the ancient Greek ideal, such that many of the stances he struck could be summed up in a single word: statuesque. His modified victory pose, where he held both hands overhead with elbows bent, along with his trademark vacuum, were probably his most iconic. But the main reason Zane doesn't place any higher is because his transitions often left a little to be desired. Looking at still photos of him and Arnold, it's easy to see how one might jump to the conclusion that they were the best posers to ever live, but watching them in motion reveals certain areas for improvement, and several bodybuilders from later decades would go on to do precisely that. Take, for instance, this next gentleman coming in at number 8, Francis Benfato. And for the record, this guy was the reason Kevin Levrone didn't crack the top 10, because I initially had a spot reserved for him here, but Benfato impressed me so much that I could not in good conscience exclude him. His routine here from the 1990 Mr. Olympia might even be my personal favorite, along with Dennis Wolf's from part 1, because it was just such a compelling performance, set to some ominous orchestral music. I guess I'm really just a sucker for epic soundtracks like this. Now, this is a routine you really owe it to yourself to watch from start to finish, so I'll provide the link to it along with all the rest in the description below in case you're interested. But there exists a sort of synergy here in the way his refined and elegant posing style just perfectly reflects that aesthetic and chiseled physique. Only a handful of bodybuilders throughout history could ever pull this type of thing off, even if they had the skill set to do so, because without the necessary symmetry and proportions to match, it would just look foolish. The only reason Benfato doesn't place even higher is because he unfortunately does wobble and shake briefly a couple of times during this routine, so the execution wasn't quite flawless, but it was pretty damn close nonetheless. And like I said, still one of my favorite individual displays in the entire list. Switching things up at number 7 is the one they called Marvelous Melvin Anthony. So far in this top 10, we've seen a bunch of old school legends, but this guy was thoroughly part of the new wave, a flashy showman who competed back in the early to mid 2000s, And this clip right here is from the 2005 Ironman, in case you're curious. Now, for those of you who aren't old enough to remember or otherwise weren't into bodybuilding back then, Melvin Anthony was basically like the predecessor to Kai Greene, because before Kai came along, Melvin was the guy people talked about in the conversation for best poser of all time. His style was rather cocky and flamboyant, as you can see here with all the fancy transitions. Melvin had a very pretty physique reminiscent of someone like Flex Wheeler and posed accordingly, with the first half of his routines typically following more of a classic template, but then he'd spice it up towards the end with some high-energy dance moves like this, including his trademark Matrix maneuver we'll see in a moment, where he looks like Neo dodging bullets. Depending on your individual tastes, you might not enjoy this particular brand of posing, but you cannot deny the man had some outstanding control of his body and knew how to show it off. And this here is my favorite part of the whole routine, where he simulates an on-stage electrocution. Just so cool. Maybe not strictly bodybuilding and definitely not classic, but easily one of the very best posers to ever do it nonetheless. Now, I realize some of you old school purists can't stand this more modern approach to posing and consider it a disgrace. And I get it, I'm not a big fan of all the dancing stuff myself, especially when it becomes over-sexualized and begins to skirt that line between competitive bodybuilding and something like male stripping. But we have to remember that posing is an art form, and try to remain open-minded and acknowledge talent when we see it, regardless of whether it conforms to our own personal preferences or expectations. The fact of the matter is, Melvin has absolutely earned his spot on this list, whether you approve of him or not. Ditto for this next entry, because fittingly enough, we have his spiritual successor in Kai Greene following up at number 6. I suspect Kai's inclusion here may prove the most divisive for all the same reasons I was just mentioning regarding Melvin Anthony, and juxtaposed with the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger himself has stated on multiple occasions that Kai is the greatest poser he's ever seen. So on the one hand, I know some of you out there will be upset he wasn't closer to number 1, but on the other hand, a few people are going to be offended he even made the list at all. Well, I guess it's like what Bob Ciccarello commented about Branch Warren back at the 2010 Arnold Classic, where he said it's tough to say whether Branch should be 5th place or 1st because his physique was so different to everyone else's. And I feel the exact same way about Kai Greene's posing. His ranking could vary tremendously because it's so hard to compare his unorthodox style to anyone else's. But love him or hate him, his onstage virtues are numerous. For one thing, perhaps no one else in all of history has ever demonstrated a greater degree of mind-muscle connection in terms of being able to consciously contract and activate precise regions of his body whenever he poses. Not only that, but the dude had the balance and agility of a cat, because despite all his outlandish headstands and crazy somersaults and such, you would never once catch him slipping or staggering. For a man of his extreme size and weight, then, Kai may very well be the most coordinated human being on the planet. Another thing I have to commend is that he's always mixing it up and trying new things, keeping it fresh. He never repeats the same routine twice, but is constantly experimenting and challenging himself to explore different avenues of artistic expression. One thing's for certain, Kai Greene is truly an artist at heart and one of the most creative individuals the sport has ever seen. But returning to the golden era, we have Muhammad Makawe at number 5. And honestly, from this point on, you could make a valid case for any of these remaining top 5 guys deserving the distinction of best poser ever, even top 6 if you prefer the more modern method of Kai Greene, because they were all transcendent in their own way. But Makawe was a classic poser through and through, the Egyptian-born bodybuilder whose professional career really reached its peak in the early to mid-80s, brought an exotic flavor to the stage with his artful approach. And he was a master of illusion. Aside from Schwarzenegger himself, perhaps nobody else was ever as adept at masking weaknesses while simultaneously highlighting strengths. In Makawe's case, his massive triceps and low tapering lats, which he displayed to their absolute fullest in his signature twisted kneeling pose and the variety of ways he'd flex and showcase his arms. Another one of his trademarks was the flourishing hand gestures he would frequently incorporate into his transitions, and also his tendency to alter pacing and tempo. One moment, he'd be moving very slow and smoothly, almost lulling you into a trance, and the next he'd lunge forward emphatically into his next shot. Makawe's style was certainly very uncommon and innovative, and like Dickerson or Zane, it was pure class from start to finish and always a pleasure to watch. And Bob Paris makes his mark at number 4. Here was another classic 80s legend who picked up right where Makawe left off. Paris's posing was simply immaculate. I dare say that no one ever posed more aesthetically, and what I mean by this is that out of all the highly aesthetic physiques to come and go over the decades, I think Paris showcased his physique in the most beautiful way possible. It's been said that he was like the second coming of Steve Reeves, in the sense that here was an Adonis who not only turned heads, but could practically turn a straight man gay with his breathtaking performances, like this one here at the 1988 Athens Grand Prix. And just a note, he did do the same routine at the 88 Olympia as well and was more conditioned there, but the video quality of this clip was better, so that's why I went with this one. And likely not since the early days of Arnold and Zane has another bodybuilder been as influential to the art of posing. Now, you long-term fans who were around to witness the glory days of the 80s can confirm for us, but I believe Bob Paris was the first to do this iconic kneeling pose where he leaned back and placed one hand behind his head while the other reached for the sky. I can't even count the number of bodybuilders who would go on to emulate this pose, including some of my all-time favorites like Kevin Levrone and Sean Ray. Speaking of which, here he is, landing all the way up at number 3. Sean Ray was a supremely graceful poser who always put a ton of thought and effort and attention to detail into all of his posing routines, and he had so many memorable performances over the years, so I thought I'd show you one of his lesser-known contests way back towards the beginning of his career, here at the 1990 Ironman Pro. Now, admittedly, Sean had it easier than most. With his spectacular shape and conditioning, he could probably look artistic just walking out and hitting a succession of mandatories. Not only that, but due to his lack of obvious weak points, Ray could strike practically any pose imaginable and manage to look good while doing so, a very rare luxury indeed. But as with all the other noteworthy posers featured in this video, Sean played to his strengths, primarily opting for classic shots that suited his physique by emphasizing his symmetry and finer details. He also tended to select songs he genuinely enjoyed, which created an emotional element on stage that audiences could feel and appreciate. For all these reasons, not to mention his extraordinary consistency, Sean Ray could easily be viewed as number 1, but there's 2 other men who I would put just a fraction above him. The first of these, at number 2, is the original master poser himself, the late, great Ed Corney. May he rest in peace. And I know this is controversial, especially in light of his recent passing. I can already hear you demanding, how could he not be number 1? How could you disrespect his legacy like that? Okay, now hear me out, guys. Corney's the obvious choice for greatest poser ever. And fair enough, he might very well be. Certainly if we go by secondhand reports from all those who witnessed him live back in the day, he would seem to be the indisputable GOAT. The problem is that actual posing footage of the man is extremely scarce. I've only been able to uncover just 2 routines, both where he looked well past his prime, like this one we're looking at from the 1983 Olympia, where he was age 50 with a full head of gray hair, plus the 30 seconds or so from his scenes in Pumping Iron, which prompted Arnold to famously exclaim,
I mean, that's what I call posing.
So based on such a limited sample size, I'm simply not comfortable with crowning him the best of all time. But still, there's no denying his utter mastery of presentation. There was a certain majesty about Ed Corney's movements that made him almost mesmerizing to watch. And the phrase Steady Eddie may very well have been coined after Ed Corney, as one of his trademarks was the ability to hold poses for lengthy durations of time while remaining perfectly still like a statue. In fact, I'd contend that no other bodybuilder could ever maintain a pose as well as he did. There was not a trace of trembling or discomfort to be seen, no matter what shot he executed. But while Corney's posing was absolutely sublime, for what it was, he seemed to lack the dynamic quality and tempo of the man I put ahead of him. Again, due to the lack of video evidence, I haven't seen first-hand evidence of these traits, which is the main reason I'm relegating Ed Corney to runner-up. And this brings us inevitably to number 1, which is, of course, Paul Dillette. I mean, what can I say, guys? I was going to put Corney on top, but the people have spoken. So here, by popular demand, is the incomparable Freakenstein himself. Now, Jurassic Paul may have been a scary-looking mountain of a man, but he posed in an amusingly frail and delicate manner. And to the untrained eye, it may look like shoddy posing, but this was in fact an advanced technique inspired by the traditional Native American dance form known as shaking leaf in the wind. Casual observers often wrongfully criticized Dillette for not holding poses properly, but this was all part of the mystique, you see, to never reveal too much at once, but always leave us wanting for more. Plus, being the stereotypically kind Canadian that he was, Paul likely didn't want to intimidate his fellow competitors and blow them off the stage, which is why he would only flash through poses in a half-baked and fleeting fashion in order to give the rest of the lineup a fighting chance. Perhaps he likewise did not want to overwhelm the judges or induce bouts of fainting in the audience by prolonged exposure to his powerful, godlike physique. Whatever the case may be, no mere mortal could ever compare to the serene posing majesty of Paul Dillette, which is why... Alright, let's cut the crap and move on to the real number one. For my money, the greatest bodybuilding poser of all time would have to be the mass with class Lee Labrada. This short sequence you see here is sufficient evidence in itself to crown him as number one. And this was part of his routine at the 1991 Olympia, which is probably the most exquisite exhibit of freestyle posing I've ever witnessed in my life, so that's what I'm going to show you here. But this wasn't just a one-hit wonder. Lee put on a terrific show every year he competed. He could pretty much do no wrong in my book. And they didn't call him the mass with class for nothing. Labrada was like poetry in motion. He possessed the kind of preternatural poise that could spark envy in a friggin' ballerina. And I intend that not in a derogatory manner, but purely as a compliment because he was unbelievably fluid and light on his feet. No disrespect to Mr. Corny, but Lee Labrada was the most polished and dynamic poser I've ever seen. He always put together a dazzlingly dramatic routine, synchronized to some excellent orchestral music, and the execution was simply flawless. Every pose was held superbly steady, every transition was unique and purposeful and silky smooth, and he included such a plethora of original artistic shots, all of which conformed perfectly to his type of physique. And while it's true that Labrada may not have had the same lasting impact on future generations as pioneers like Arnold or Zane, the latter of whom he definitely adopted some of his own moveset from, I still believe that Lee projected a noticeably more refined and sophisticated stage presence overall. Along with Ed Corney then, I consider Lee Labrada the consummate master poser. Those two are essentially 1A and 1B. Alright, so that concludes the top 20 countdown for the best posers of all time. Do you agree with these choices, or do you think I missed somebody? Let me know your thoughts and rankings in the comments below. And a couple of you guys must know me too well by now because you were able to correctly guess 8 or 9 or even all 10 of the names featured here after watching part 1. So good job, you cats certainly know your stuff. But anyway, thank you all for watching and feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. Until next time, I'm the Tominator signing off and I'll be back.